for those in the chamber. Yes, welcome to the first audit committee of this new administration in Hackney Council. We have a shorter agenda this evening, and I do want to take the time just now for everyone to be welcome to the audit committee, because we've got some new elected councillors, plus we've also got councillors that are new to the audit committee. So if possible, if we could take a moment for people to introduce themselves. So obviously I have been elected as the chair of audit committee, and I'd like to introduce Councillor Lynn Charlton as vice chair. And then we've got Councillor, do you want to introduce yourself, Gilbert?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Councillor Smith, Stoke Newington Ward.
Rob, do you want to introduce yourself and your role?
Councillor Chapman, I'm the Cabinet Member for Finance, Insourcing and Customer Services, Hobbiton Ward member.
Councillor Zoe Garbett of Dalston Ward.
And to my left, I've got some of our officers here as well.
Good evening, my name is Dawn Carter MacDonald. I'm the Director of Legal, Democratic and Election Services. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Ian Williams, Group Director of Finance and Corporate Resources.
Good evening all. My name's Suresh Patel. I'm a partner with Mazar. We're your external auditors.
And also my wingman for this evening.
Good evening, Bruce Gray, Governance Officer.
Great, that's great, thank you. And I think as we go through, I'm mindful that we've missing some members, so as they come through, we'll ask them to introduce themselves when they speak. So our first item is apologies for absence. Peter, do we have any?
I don't have them received any.
No, okay. I'm aware we're live streaming. Do we have people?
We have two people.
Two people, okay. So just for that instance, I'm just going to read out our protocol for participation in remote meetings. You can only speak when invited to by the chair. If you wish to speak, please raise your hand and direct all communications via the chair. And please ensure that your mics are muted when you're not speaking. And if you're referring to a specific page or picture in a report, refer to the page number. If you are having any technical difficulties, we do have Mario, who's also joining us remotely, and you can use the chat function in the Google Meet to alert the meeting, or you can dial in on the phone number using the provided within the invite. I would ask that we do not use the chat function for putting formal questions to the committee or to make any other comments. Thank you. So agenda item 2, declarations of interest. Do any members have any declarations of interest? Okay, and then we have agenda item 3, which is minutes of the previous meeting. Again, mindful that there's probably only a few of us that were at that last meeting, given that the committee's changed, but please let me know if there's anything that people want to, we will be going through actions that arose from that meeting, but if there's anything people have got regarding minutes. Councillor Smythe.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just at point 8.5, where the committee was told that the financial advisors were working on the impact of the increase in inflation and interest rates, borrowing and investments. I'm just wondering if that was an action, and if it's been sorted out.
I've got a list. I think Mr. Williams, you'll be going through some of the actions from that, aren't you? So I think that is in that list of actions.
I'm happy to answer that one if that's okay,
Yeah,
Councillor.
that'd be great. Thank you.
Certainly, before the meeting, we circulated to all members a schedule of all the actions. In terms of 8.5, really, that was a piece of work which the team have been doing for me in line with updating the medium-term planning forecast. So that's in train, and it wouldn't be something that would come here as a sort of standalone item, just reflecting it's a piece of the jigsaw that we're putting together. So that's
Okay. No, I think, can I just check, Peter, have we got Councillor Gordon?
Not in the room, but she's not on there.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, next agenda item is agenda item 4, which is just to note the appointment of the chair and vice chair of the licensing committee. Members are required to note the confirmed appointments of Councillor Lynch, myself, to the position of chair, and Councillor Lynn Troughton to the position of vice chair of the audit committee, as agreed by the full council at its annual meeting on the 25th of May 2022. Noted, thank you. Okay, so then we're coming on to agenda item 5, which is terms of reference of the Audit Committee. So this is a timely opportunity to, have I missed something? I have, haven't I? Action points for the Audit Committee.
We've circulated a schedule to everyone of the actions. so
Okay,
they've all
that's
been
fine,
covered,
sorry,
so
yeah.
it's-
And people were given the opportunity, weren't they? Yes. Bear with me. So yeah, terms of reference of the Audit Committee, which is item 5. So hopefully members have had opportunity to look at these and ask any questions or ask for any clarification. Councillor Sarah.
Young. Hi.
Sarah.
I just wanted to check, I've read through these, but I just wanted to check whether there are any changes to the previous year's terms of reference or whether these are exactly the same.
There are no changes in terms of reference.
Thank you.
I think it'd be useful just to give assurance that I think the terms of reference for this audit committee is probably is reflective of what's recommended for audit committees as well, and other sort of local authority audit committees as well, and they've worked well in the past. Okay, we're whizzing through, guys. And so we're now on to agenda item 6, which is the finance update. And Ian Williams, our Group Director for Corporate Resources, will be able to provide that for us. And then members will have an opportunity to digest that and, via myself, ask any questions for any clarification.
Great stuff, and thank you for that, Councillor Lynch. So under this item, what we're going to cover is, and particularly mindful that we've got a number of new members of Audit Committee here today, I was going to do a quick run through of what the role of Audit Committee is. I know it's set out in the terms of reference at one level, but we want to just give you an opportunity to explain the distinction between Audit Committee, the Internal Audit Service, which Michael Sheffield leads, and also then External Audit, of which we're very fortunate to have Suresh with us here today as well. Peter, is it possible? I'm going to present some slides up, so could you maybe turn the lights back on? Sorry, it's okay. It's no problem. So it'll give me a chance to share my screen. So that's all good. There we go. Remind myself to do it. There we go. All worked, does it? I don't know. Why has it done that? There it is. That's better. Great stuff. So everyone can see that, hopefully. So I'm going to quickly canter through what the role of the Audit Committee is and explain a bit about the distinction between the Internal Audit Service and the External Audit Service. Not wanting to move today, is it? I'm meant to be driving, aren't I?
Apologies, we're just having a few technical issues. We'll soon resolve.
That's very strange. Let's. What I'll do is I'll come out of it and go back in. That's.
Are you sure?
Yeah. That's
Just at that point, Ian, I just wanted to note that Councillor Gordon has joined us online, and also just to note that I failed to allow Michael and Matthew to introduce themselves, but you can when you do your agenda items. But it was just to note that we welcome you to the meeting. So thank you, and also we've got Tracy's here as well.
Right, here we go. That's a lot better. Okay, so audit committees and the governance framework. The core functions of an audit committee are to provide oversight of a range of key governance and accountability arrangements in a council. They're there to ensure that the responses to the recommendations of the assurance providers are adequate. And so again, that builds upon the work that Michael's team do for us, and also helps us to ensure that there's robust arrangements that we've got in place and maintained. So this includes an audit committee, both oversight of internal and external audit, and the review of financial and governance reports to help ensure that we've got the adequate arrangements in place. So accountabilities of the audit committee, it reports annually to the full council, and it provides an update on the effectiveness of the work of the committee and provides assurance on the arrangements that we have in place for things like governance, risk management and internal control frameworks, of which we've got an update on our corporate risk strategy this evening, updates on financial reporting, and also as oversight on internal audit and external audit. In terms of risk management, what we look to set out here is the sense of having a robust risk management framework in place, and that's essential really to ensure that current and future risks are identified and are planned for. And the members of this committee who've been on audit previously will be aware of the number of risk registers we bring to this committee. We bring departmental risk registers to each meeting, or the corporate risk register, which is, say, we've got on the agenda today. It effectively approves the council's appetite for risk, its risk strategy and risk policy. And when we come to the final item of this agenda, you'll see the work programme we've got for the committee over the course of this year. Turning to internal control and governance, what you'll receive is quarterly progress reports that will cover not just performance management against sort of key suites of indicators, but we'll give updates on how the internal audit service is performing, the work it's doing, and also what it's doing in terms of its counter-fraud activities. And those of you who've had a chance to go through the papers already for this evening will see some of the outputs that the team have delivered for us in terms of tenancy fraud, blue badge fraud, recoveries, etc. In addition to that, the audit committee also reviews what's called the annual governance statement, and this is part of the annual accounts approval process. The annual governance statement is an internal review of the governance arrangements for each directorate, and it's verified by each group director. It's then brought together in one overall overarching annual governance statement that sits at the front of the statement of accounts and is reviewed by the external auditors in partnership with internal audit. In terms of financial management, the financial management environment for all authorities has become, as you all know, increasingly challenging in recent years, and the committee's role is in supporting strong financial management, and that has become ever more important. And I know previous cabinet members for finance and myself, and obviously with Councillor Chapman now, have really welcomed the support we've received from this committee and from the scrutiny panel as well in assisting us in undertaking that role, supporting the Mayor and Cabinet. Regular financial update reports are also provided to this committee, of which we'll have one in a moment on the next item on this agenda, and that looks to inform the committee and provide assurance that resources are properly being managed. A key function of the committee is to review and adopt the annual statement of accounts, and I think we saw that at our last meeting when we brought that through. So financial management, treasury management, we had an extensive training session on that before today's audit committee meeting, but just to remind people that what we have and bring to audit committee is the annual treasury management strategy for approval, as well as the quarterly performance updates, which hopefully now we've done that training session will be more helpful to people. In addition, the committee also maintains an overview of the council's investment and borrowing arrangements in line with the Treasury Management Code. Turning to internal audit. Internal audit is an independent assurance function that may review any area of council activity, and this committee has each year approved the internal audit plan. An annual risk-based plan setting out future audit reviews across all work areas of the council is prepared. An audit committee reviews that, approves that work plan, and is kept informed of any changes that take place. The committee also receives what's called the annual audit assurance opinion on the state of the council's control framework. And again, that is something that's a really important part of our governance arrangements. The service is also responsible for investigating any potential frauds against the council, and again, as I say, a quarterly update on this is provided. Turning to external auditor and the role of our external auditor. Our current external auditors are Mazars, and Mazars have been our external auditors for a good few years now, haven't they? I think it's about 3 years. That's right. And the role of the external auditor is, is to reflect the special accountability attached to public money and the conduct of public business. The external audit of local authorities is characterised by two distinctive features. The scope of the external auditor's work is centred on the audit of financial statements, but also consideration is given to economy, efficiency and effectiveness. Auditors have the statutory powers under the 2014 Act to issue a report in the public interest, and members will be aware of a number of these being issued in other local authorities in the last 12 to 18 months. We've seen them in Nottingham, in Croydon more recently, and also in Slough and in other places. When a report in public interest is issued, it must be considered and responded to publicly, and ultimately the external auditor can apply to the court for a declaration that an item of account is contrary to law and can issue what's called an advisory notice. I think it's important to be clear what external audit does and what it doesn't do. So things they don't do is give absolute assurance. They don't actively seek to identify fraud, and they don't give an opinion on internal controls or test everything. But what they do undertake is give reasonable assurance on the financial statements. They are mindful of the risk of fraud, and they consider the council's overall control environment with a focus on risks of material misstatement. And again, when we looked at the external auditors' plans and their approach to the external the audit of the statement of accounts, they set out there the tests and the risks that they look closely at. So just to be clear, the external auditor is not a substitute for the council's responsibility for putting in place proper arrangements in support of the proper conduct of public business and for ensuring that public money is safeguarded, properly accounted for and used with due regard for value for money. External audit and the approach that the team here have. So for financial statements, designed to provide the council with an audit that complies with professional requirements, is conducted in accordance with international standards of auditing. The work is focused very much on those aspects which are considered to have higher risk of material misstatement. They also plan the audit to have a reasonable expectation of detecting any fraud where the potential effects would be material. And an audit is planned and performed so as to provide that reasonable assurance that the financial statements are free of material misstatement and give a true and fair view. A key area of the work of external auditor, as I alluded to earlier, around efficiency, effectiveness and economy is in terms of value for money. They are required to consider the authority's arrangements to secure value for money in how it uses its resources, and it breaks it down really into three sub-criteria: financial sustainability, governance, and improving economy, efficiency and effectiveness. There's no separate opinion or conclusion, but significant weaknesses are to be reported on an exception basis, and these findings would be included in the auditor's annual report. Finally, we're going to touch upon a few developments in the world of external audit. Members, I'm sure, will have seen that the government has finally responded to what's called the local audit framework and the technical consultation that took place on the back of the Redmond review that concluded actually in 2019, although it doesn't seem yesterday. Where have the last few years gone? It sets out how the Financial Reporting Council is being replaced by what's called the Audit Reporting and Governance Authority, ARGA. And ARGA will be the local audit system leader, and recently there's been a director of local audit appointed to oversee that organisation. Other developments are proposals to make it mandatory now for an audit committee to have one independent member, which is quite an interesting development. Some councils do it, others don't. Also, government funding via the LGA sector grant for targeted training events for audit committee chairs and members. And we'll touch upon this in a moment, but Michael and the team with Councillor Lynch have got a series of training opportunities that are available to all members of audit committee, provided externally through people like the LGA, which certainly if people are interested in attending them, we're really keen for people to attend, and certainly Councillor Lynch will be writing out to you with the details of that following this meeting. The department is working closely with ARGA and the audit firms to develop an industry-led workforce strategy, and I think Suresh might want to chip in here a bit more, but one of the challenges that that audit firms have had is actually recruiting people to work on public audits. It's been a real challenge in terms of retaining and attracting people to want to do local authority audits, but also I think it's preferred to say other public sector audits as well. And that has at times led to some of the issues we've seen with accounts being audited quickly and timely. Yes, and I jumped ahead of myself there. As you can see, training resources, finally help is available for new committee members to assist introduction to the work of the committee, sit for run courses, as do the LGA, and I'll say a link will be circulated after this meeting. So that's all from me, Councillor Lynch. Hope that was helpful.
Thanks, Ian. Has anyone got any initial questions just around any of that? Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I just wondered what the problem was with recruiting auditors to do local government audits. That's new to me, and because I always thought it was something that was quite an attractive proposition.
It's fair to say that this is not actually just an issue that affects audit of public sector bodies, but the audit profession as a whole. And part of the reason why the job has become less attractive is because we are hugely regulated, and you'll have seen in the press fines dished out to audit firms and partners for the audit quality not being as high as it needs to be. So that has really contributed to a lot of graduates that we have deciding that once they've got qualified, they'll just go off and work in industry. And that has affected, not like I say, it's not just public sector, but it's also the corporate auditors as well.
Great, thanks. Ian, will you now be going on to do your formal finance update?
That's okay, Councillor Lynch.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's see if I can get the slides to appear a bit more of a timely fashion this time. Thanks for that, Peter. Okay, so for members who are new to this committee, one of the things we have brought into place as part of the regular audit committee updates really is what we call a finance update. And in addition to receiving copies of the latest overall financial performance, which you'll get as part of the usual cabinet papers that come through, what myself, Councillor Chapman, and the previous chair of audit and going forwards, Councillor Lynch, were really keen to do was to make sure that this committee was cited on recent developments and just had a good understanding of the overall financial context within which the council's operating, but also has an understanding of more wider issues in terms of those affecting local authorities, and in particular where we can drill it down into sort of borough issues, we will do that as well. So what I'll do is I'll run through these slides at a gentle pace. So I'm happy to take questions as we go, if that's okay. And what we tend to do is, because we try and keep them as real and as live as possible, so they're not out of date the moment you get them. By the time you get to the committee, Peter and the team will circulate them to you all afterwards as well. And as always, we're around to take any questions that may come up as you peruse them over the coming days, which I'm sure you will. Okay, so what I'm going to cover today is a quick update on where we got to with the budget forecast for the previous financial years. Also covering not just the general fund, but the housing revenue account. In addition to that, also we'll cover where we are with the medium-term financial forecast and just give some context to some of the real challenges we're seeing come through around inflation. We'll give an outline of where we're heading to in terms of 23-24's budget, and particularly for those of you who are new to local government and budget setting, just want to make sure you're familiar with just the timescales we go through there. So allude to an update on where we are with things in London, and then finally just a quick update on where we are with statement of accounts issues as well. So quite a few things in here, so please do shout out if anything isn't clear. So in terms of the forecast for the financial year that's just gone, so we've just in the process of closing the accounts for financial year 21-22, and Councillor Chapman and I are in the process of signing off the committee report that will effectively be our outturn report for Cabinet, which will go in July, which will summarise the position as at the end of March. We're forecasting an overspend of around £4.6 million. Not a real surprise, that given the pressures we've had in terms of COVID and challenges with regards to cyber, but also some inflationary pressures that have been coming through. For those of you who haven't been avid readers of the OFP, it's pretty fair to say when we took the OFP to Cabinet around the summertime, we were forecasting then an overspend of around £8 million. But what we put in place was measures to mitigate and reduce that overspend position. But it is fair to say that 21-22, as 2021 have been challenging financial years for all the reasons we're all aware of. That gives some context of the areas where the overspend has occurred in a bit more detail, but the OFP we're taking through Cabinet for the July meeting will go into it in a lot more detail.
Sorry, Lynn.
Thanks, Chair. Ian, you did say, be interactive. So
Oh, certainly, yes, sorry, I didn't see you.
So I just wondered about the overspend. I mean, is that related, do you think, to one-off costs that, aren't going to carry forward into the next financial year? Or is this something we're going to have to manage down over a period of time?
That's a very good question, Councillor Troughton, and it's one which myself and the team have been discussing extensively with Councillor Chapman as we developed not just the budget for 22-23 and the medium-term forecast for beyond the current financial year. It's probably the simple answer is it's a combination. So there will be things in there that are actually going to be recurrent, and so we'll need to make ongoing provision for those. A good example of that would be particularly where the cost of care packages has risen with inflationary pressures, or we're seeing increased demand coming into the system. There are other areas, for example, where over the course of the year, some of our properties that we let commercially, some of the businesses in there, understandably, weren't able to pay their full rent, and the commercial property team, working closely with finance, have been putting in place arrangements to mitigate some of the impacts on those businesses that were particularly affected, so that we didn't just lurch straight, as some landlords may have done, to just say, if you can't pay your rent, you're out. Actually, we value our tenants really much, and a lot of them provide really important services to residents. So we've worked with those who got into difficulty to support them in their occupation. There will be other costs, as you can see. We've incurred some one-off costs in relation to response to the cyber attack to deal with some of the backlogs in some services that will be relatively time limited. So it is a combination of costs, but what we are setting out in the OFP that's going to Cabinet in July is more detail about where those overspends are, and the ones which are recurrent and the ones which effectively are one-off, and how we're dealing with them.
And Sarah.
Can I just check whether the SEN, the ongoing SEN overspend is reflected in the figures you just showed us, or if that's somewhere else?
So in terms of SEND pressures, and this committee was very much at the forefront of identifying not just issues in Hackney with SEND provision and the way that the costs of that are constructed, but also the fact that nationally the system for SEND funding is broken, and a very useful deep dive report was produced and signed off by this committee a good few years ago, which if people who are new to the committee haven't seen, I'm very happy to get circulated, because it puts into context the issues which all councils now are grappling with. But to answer your question very simply, it isn't included in that part of the outturn forecast, because it's the council's finances effectively are partitioned into three key areas. You have the general fund, the housing revenue account, and we have the dedicated schools grant, which is the sort of the three core areas. It's okay, I'll keep going. Next area, sort of segues.
Sorry, Ian. I can just see that Zoe's got her hand
Sorry.
up.
Sorry, just on the one before, at the slide before, yeah, that one. What can you give any detail on the 2 million COVID related? How that, just what the context is,
Yes,
what that actually means.
So a big challenge that the Neighbourhood Housing team had would be in relation to income that had been lost from not being able to do, basically, the commercial waste activity was obviously heavily curtailed throughout a lot of 21-22 because businesses weren't open, and that obviously means income wasn't being generated, and so the service had a loss of income. There were other areas within that service that saw losses of income in terms of on street, on the things outside cafes, shops, and that side of it. The leisure service incurred extra costs when it opened. So there was a whole range of things in terms of some losses of income, some costs, which again we'll highlight in more detail as we set out the OFP. So turning to the housing revenue account, forecast position on that is we in the process of closing the accounts, but we're looking at an overspend of around £4.7 million, and predominantly that's driven by a number of factors. One is a reduction of rental income, predominantly due to challenges that we've experienced throughout the pandemic about being able to of tenants' ability to pay. Some impact of the cyber attack on systems and information, which has meant that the teams haven't been as informed to be able to collect the money, but also, and as this committee's seen in the corporate risk register updates, we've seen significant number of residents move from housing benefit to universal credit, and that obviously leads to changes in the way that their payments interact with us. So with housing benefit, traditionally, effectively, we get paid the money and then we pay it to ourselves. With universal credit, very simply, the money goes to the resident and then they have to pay us. And unless they're in at least 8 weeks arrears, we're not able to apply, in effect, for us to have the money directly from their universal credit. So there've been some challenges in that space. Obviously, there's been impacts upon the work that the direct labour organisation could undertake due to not being able to provide a full range of services. And as I alluded to earlier, some of our commercial properties that are in what's classified as HRA properties were unable to trade and operate as they would have done previously, and hence that impacts on their ability to pay rent. So a number of factors in there. Turning to the council's medium-term financial plan. So as we set out in our report to full council back in March, full council agreed balanced budget for 22-23, and what we also set out in the medium-term forecast there was our projections for the next 3 years. And as I'm sure a number of members of this committee know, as always, it seems with local government finance at the moment, we're in a very uncertain time in terms of what we understand government's intention to be in terms of how it's going to provide funding to local authorities. We don't know what the settlement will be for next year. We haven't had confirmation that fairer funding won't happen. We are aware of, and we're all aware of, the very significant number of moving parts that are at play at the moment in terms of cost pressures, inflation, etc. So what we set out in our medium-term forecasts is a range of scenarios really that are based upon a number of factors that looks to sort of model the potential shortfalls in funding that may exist. What I would say is we're in the process of refining and updating this, and we'll come back to Cabinet probably after the summer now, that will sort of take on board any updated information from government, which we're hoping if there is going to be any, it will come out soon in terms of whether fairer funding or the business rates reset will happen or not. And we'll report that back to the next of these committees.
Ian, sorry, you're in full flow there. We've got a question from Councillor Margaret Borden.
Thanks very much, Chair. Thanks for the update, Ian. I just wonder whether it would be possible for you to just really outline a little bit more about the sort of fairer funding proposals and how they, if they go ahead, how they'd be likely to impact us in Hackney. Thank you.
Yes, certainly, Councillor Gordon, and very happy also outside of this meeting to maybe do a slightly more detailed briefing note as well for colleagues, mindful that we've got people who are very new to this committee and others who've probably heard me talk about this far too often. But in simple terms, fairer funding is effectively is the term given to a review of the way that money is distributed to local authorities. So currently, local authorities receive money on a formula basis, in simple terms, and that's predominantly driven by factors like population, has regard to things like deprivation, has regard to demographic factors, and also has regard to the cost of providing services in particular localities. So it recognises the cost of doing business in London is more expensive than, say, somewhere in the northeast. What currently is happening with regards to fairer funding is that a lot of the formulae that are embedded in that system are now quite dated. We've been promised reform of local government funding now for probably the last 5 or 6 years, and it's consistently not progressed beyond just a roll forward of the existing formula and approaches and styles, but it's constantly been there on the horizon of something that needed to happen. And I did think if COVID hadn't happened, I think it might have progressed at a greater pace. But simply, it's the way in which authorities are going to be funded in the future. And I think the big risk to us in Hackney is what we do know is that the actual pot of money that is there to be distributed isn't going to increase significantly. And so if you're going to look to redistribute the same pot of money by different formula, you can have winners and losers. And I think, we all are aware of the term levelling up and some of the definitions we've seen of that. And there is a fear that that will see resources move from the southeast, London in particular, to other areas of the country. It is fair to say that under the current formula, on a per capita basis, inner London boroughs tend to receive more funding per head. That's a simple, mathematical reality. But the big point for us is, our view is that the rationale for that is it's the cost of doing business in London, it's the complexity, it's the significant deprivation that has to be dealt with. And so it's something that with Councillor Chapman and his predecessors, we've been very active in terms of lobbying government at every opportunity to reinforce the risks to places like Hackney of significant redistribution. But again, we're happy to do a more detailed session on this and what it's looking like at one of the members' training sessions in the future. I hope that answers your question, Councillor Gordon.
Councillor Rob Chapman's raised his hand. Is our cabinet leader?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Just to add to that, really, the obvious point that Ian can't really say is, of course, it's a Conservative government and it's a politically led agenda, and the redistribution, the name fairer funding, well, and it's politically led agenda with the view of distributing it in a way which more suits their purposes. Nonetheless, we continue to regularly lobby them and officials on particularly technical points to make sure that we do come out of it the best that we can.
And just before we go back to Ian, is it fair to say, Rob, as well, that when you are looking at the budget, obviously I can see that the first forecast is going to the July cabinet meeting. You always have this with the cabinet that fair funding is going to be good. You obviously you've presented it as the worst case scenario, so there won't be any surprises.
I think yes. I mean, worst case scenario. Well, we're coming onto that now, aren't we? Really.
Okay,
so I'll leave that there. Obviously, there's a whole range of possibilities and uncertainties, but and we got to. In the end, you have to come to a view, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the slide here really just tries to draw into one slide the appendix, which was included as part of the budget report, which was the medium-term forecast. And the table you can see here was very clearly set out in that report. So turning to the housing revenue account forecast, we've done some work again to try and see the shape of the HRA business plan, and are, as you'd expect, doing further reviews of that, given the real pressures the HRA is under from inflation and the fact that it's got to be a ring-fenced and is a ring-fenced account. So at this point, we're looking at some savings forecasts on the housing revenue account of around £1 million or so a year, but that's based upon projections of income and expenditure as currently set out. But what I've asked the team to do is just revisit some of those just to make sure that we've captured all the real pressures that are coming through, particularly around energy costs in that area, which obviously we have to fund, particularly where it's things that aren't recovered through rents or through leaseholder charges.
Sorry, Ian, I've just got Margaret's just raised her hand, I think, to ask a question.
Yeah, apologies, Chair, for coming in again. I just wondering, Ian, you may be coming to this. What sort of impact this may have on our, will have on our capital spending, capital programme?
In terms of just the HRA aspect, sorry, was that?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean the situation with the HRA, how that will relate to opportunities for our capital programme.
I mean, the simple answer to that is, what we're doing at the moment is reviewing the housing revenue account business plan and looking to make sure that we can look to fund the commitments we need, particularly to maintain our stock, but also to create the headroom to enable us to invest in new council homes and retrofit. That's a piece of detailed work that's ongoing at the moment, and we'll be reporting that back, as you'd expect, over the coming months. So turning to some assumptions and risks, as we said at the last audit committee, we highlighted some of the risks around inflation, fairer funding, recovery from cyber attack. But I also think, and I've said this before, there's still some increasing demand that will be in the system from things like the long COVID impacts that will inevitably still come into play. Turning to the budget for 23-24. Got a lot of years open at the moment, it seems, when you look at the accounts and where we are with the current financial year. But in simple terms, as you'd expect, council is well underway in terms of developing budget proposals and thinking about how we shape the budget for 23-24. And the usual timeline for that is that, as you all know, we have to set legally a balanced budget. And what we look to do there is make sure that it ties in with our strategic plan development, the work we're doing on transformation, and the work programme is to see over the course of the next few months an updated medium-term financial plan with development of options, proposals, member engagement, and throughout October and December, as members who've been on council will be aware, we will hold a series of sessions with scrutiny commissions. Members drop-in sessions are something that Councillor Chapman and I are very keen to do, enabling us to ultimately sign off and agree the HRA business plan, rent report, and ultimately the final reports to full council, which is scheduled in the diary this year for the 1st of March. It's going to be an interesting year with the way inflation is. So again, just to highlight to people, you'll know from the work that Councillor Lynch led on as part of the task and finish group on fees and charges that some of our fees and charges have a link traditionally to inflation, and obviously that will require us to give some consideration to that in due course. But that's something we're working closely with colleagues across London on, and actually across local government. Turning very quickly to some London picture issues. Again, no surprise that something that's particularly talked about is the pressure across London, and particularly on staffing costs. So some very quick modelling that was done by the team based upon a number of returns that came back from a number of boroughs. I think got 25 returns. Was that there's some significant potential challenges in if pay awards exceed what boroughs have budgeted for in 22-23. What's very clear is that more than half of boroughs have budgeted around 2 to 3% in their pay inflation figures. The latest submission by the unions yesterday was around 10%. So obviously that'll go through the usual processes of negotiation. But just put into context, in Hackney, 1% on the pay bill on the general fund equates to, broadly speaking, about £2 million. And the other side of that equation, which is council tax, a 1% increase in council tax rate is about £950,000. So just important context to put that into perspective. In terms of running costs, I think one we've seen extensively in the press recently is the real pressures that leisure centres are incurring in terms of energy costs. Obviously, the cost of heating a swimming pool and the various things that go with those are not going to be unaffected by the significant energy price increases. I know in Hackney alone, when I've looked at it with Ian Holland and his team, we've seen our energy costs rise from about £900,000 when you go back to a time when everything was open. So on that, we're using the baseline of 2019 to the current year, around £2.7 million. Again, not a great surprise. I mean, some of that is obviously having a different facility that is there in terms of the new Britannia and the more things that are offered, but it just puts into context what we're all seeing, I'm sure, in our household heating bills and running costs more generally. Yes, that's the sort of figures we're looking at. Yeah, some of that driven by having bigger, different facility as well, but in absolute terms, that's the changes. Okay, turning to accounts update. Got Suresh behind me, so he'll chip in if I get any of this wrong. The 2021 Council and Pension Fund Statement of Accounts audits are substantially complete. SIPFA, as we said, I think at the last meeting, have issued what's called a consultation aimed at resolving a long-standing issue in terms of how councils value what called infrastructure assets, but this isn't expected now to conclude until the end of this month at the earliest. And soon after that, Suresh Mazar's team will follow up on the infrastructure and plan to complete their final audit procedures and review the process. But we're pretty much waiting just for that to conclude, aren't we? Is I think where we've got to. Our plan is to publish the draft 21-22 statement of accounts by the end of July. And we're in the process of agreeing with Suresh and the team how we go about supporting them commencing the work to audit the 21-22 accounts, looking like starting in early September, I think is where we're looking, isn't it? And the aim there to conclude the audit by the 30th of November. And obviously, if there are things that can be audited earlier, we'll look to do that as we've done over many years, working closely with Mazars. At the next Audit Committee meeting, the Mazars team will present what's called their auditor's annual report, which will then conclude the audit and also any audit strategy memos that are needed. And I'm sure you'll be all glad to hear that's all from me.
Thanks, Ian. I think that was really useful, and I think I appreciate as well the slides before to give some context to the Audit Committee. So open to members, if you'd like, and welcome, Caroline. That's okay, no problem. This is your opportunity to ask some questions. Gilbert.
Thank you. I mean, the forecasts look pretty grim, to be perfectly frank, to me, and extremely worrying, actually, I have to say. My main concern, I suppose, is how you are going to manage, planning this budget going forward with inflationary elements changing so regularly, and cost of living and the war in Ukraine, and all these different factors affecting the cost of living across the board. How can we make sure that we keep on top of that flux, if that makes sense? Thank you.
So I think the first thing I'd say to that is you're absolutely right. It is a particularly challenging period because of the external factors that we can all see when we switch on the television every day. The other side to that, of course, is that what we have is a very experienced and well-established team here, and certainly Councillor Chapman and I have worked together now over many years. And what we've been doing over the last few months is looking to put in place the necessary planning arrangements for us to work towards a budget that balances for 23-24. In addition to that, working closely with colleagues across London and actually across the local government family to see opportunities to lobby government. Is it if there's possibilities for extra resources or some freedoms and flexibilities in some of that. But in terms of the medium-term forecast, as I alluded to earlier, what we presented in March, we are refining and reflecting upon in terms of what some of the changes might be in there, and we'll be looking to present updates to that to Cabinet, to this committee, going forwards. I think what I said also at the outset, I think probably in the first presentation, was in addition to that, and in addition to the sorts of updates we give to this committee, what we're also looking to get going again now that we've got committees all up and running is the regular catch-ups with Chair of Audit, the Chair of Scrutiny Panel, myself, team, Councillor Chapman, to make sure that there is real engagement there. And I think what Councillor Chapman and I have reflected on is we recognise in this particularly challenging and uncertain times, and we're very up for this, is we're very happy to do as we've been doing on a lot of challenging topics, more member drop-in sessions to take people through this and make sure everyone's got that safe space to ask any questions that they may not feel able to do necessarily always in these environments, but that offer is always there.
Thanks, Ian. And Holly, you had your...
Thanks very much, Chair. Yes, it's a grim old picture. I'm wondering whether you could explain a little bit about how we might be best placed to understand the options that are available to you. I'm particularly aware that the options all have pros and cons for our sort of political objectives or the administration's political objectives anyway, but also that we're dealing with new external drivers. I think almost everybody here has lived predominantly as a council in an era of particularly stable inflation. you'd be going back to me being in primary school for the inflation that we're now talking about. So I definitely wasn't paying attention to the council. And what therefore does that make different about the options that are available for us? I'm also interested in what this means for how we assess the impacts, because the differences on our residents will be the impacts of them will be hugely different, and whether there is any leeway at all for us to start preparing the ground for the reality that some people may have to pay more because they can.
Yeah. Sorry.
I'm happy to answer that question, or maybe if I can see other hands
Lynn,
raised.
do you want to ask a question? Yeah, so mindful of time.
Don't want to overwhelm me, and here goes. Can you tell me, sorry, maybe this is something I should know, but what the percentage of the general fund is spent on salaries, you know, payroll, and the percentage on estate? And also, I mean, have you got any idea of whether, you know, what the impact of this will be on our planned programs? Are we looking at having to push back our programs, you know, even cut some of them? Oh gosh, it's overwhelming, isn't it? It really is so worrying, as you know, as everyone realizes.
Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, Ian. Oh, sorry, Sarah. Sorry.
I realise we're not really going into detail here, but I wanted to just dig in a tiny bit on that to understand the relationship when you were looking at the HRA between the cost of the sustainability retrofitting challenge versus new build, so our new build program. So when we were talking about capital, Holly asked a question about the impact on capital expenditure. I'd really like to understand that balance there.
Ian, can you take one more from Zoe, or should we just one?
Only a tiny addition, just in addition to what Polly was saying about the importance of also considering the well-being of our staff, because I know that Polly was mentioning prioritising those things that are going to impact our residents, but obviously our staff, and considering the kind of pay pressure and all we can do to support our staff who are often our residents as well. So just how that's being considered in kind of priorities.
I'll do my best to remember all those questions. I think I've made notes of them all, but please do jump in if I don't answer anything or you don't feel I've covered the points you've asked me to clarify. So in terms of inflation, you're absolutely right, Councillor Billington, it is an unprecedented time in terms of and challenges in terms of what we're seeing. I think at one of these meetings or maybe scrutiny panel, I presented a chart showing how, you know, the change in inflation is just completely different to what we've seen over the last 30 years. And I think Pradeep, who was with me earlier, also summarised some charts that showed how interest rates had been at historic lows comparable to what, again, I'm sure some of us can remember seeing in terms of, you know, what happened in the 90s. So in terms of our assumptions going into developing the medium-term forecast, that's why we're working closely with advisors to make sure we're picking up the most accurate forecasts of where we think this will top out. A piece of work I've asked the team to pull together for me is around understanding where traditionally we've used inflation as a proxy for a change, be it in a fee and charge or be it in any contracts we have. Being clear, we understand any implications of what that looks like. Are there opportunities if it's a contract to renegotiate, to look at changing the contract, to re-provisioning it, but also picking up on your point, and it's one I'm very live to, is simply increasing something on the expectation people can pay that is illogical. And I think, you know, I alluded to the traditional approach, which, you know, is mandated effectively to us on rents. Now I think we'll need real consideration, and I've raised it with officials at BLUC to say, are you aware of this? Because traditionally councils, you know, for lots of reasons which we understand about, you know, ensuring financial sustainability of HRAs, enabling us to continue with the maintenance, that now becomes a real different consideration if it's based upon what the projections are looking like in September plus the 1%. I think none of us in the room would enter that lightly without giving real consideration. And I would expect questions to myself, to Councillor Chapman, Councillor Mackenzie about, are we sure we'll be able to actually collect that income? And I think similar considerations need to be had with regards to increasing council tax as well. As you all know, at this point in time, the rules that exist for council tax effectively are as they were for the current financial year, which is 2% or the 1.99% referendum limit plus the 1% precept. I would expect to be reconfirmed at some point. But certainly, even if there was to be a relaxation or an upward increase in the referendum limit, I again think we would have debates in various places about the likelihood of that being achievable or not just writing itself down as bad debt provision. But there are lots of things we're going to need to consider. So, as I sort of alluded to in one of the earlier questions, it's why sort of Councillor Chapman and I are really committed to that more, if you can bear spending more time with us, that is, more deeper and richer engagement about going through these issues in detail, and why I'm really keen to use groups like this, colleagues on scrutiny panels, to go through these issues so we properly understand the unintended consequences of any decisions that we might make. Obviously, that's just a discussion on the revenue side. What I've been working closely with colleagues on, responsible for the various different parts of the capital programme, is really understanding some of the decisions we're going to need to take, and whether now is right for us to consider different approaches to how we traditionally procure. So are there different ways which we can procure to look to lock in a price? So I'm aware of, as an example, you talk to people who work in the construction industry. If you want to secure a price with them, for example, for steel, which is the usual example that's given, whereas previously a price might have been held for 6 to 8 weeks, now you're lucky if they'll hold it for 6 hours. So again, we'll need to be agile in how we approach major procurements, of which we will have a substantial number, picking up on points made around how we look to take forward retrofit and new homes development, but also we've got some other ambitions around capital to do as well. I mean, on the retrofit stroke green agenda, one of the things, and I think I've said it, I think it was the previous committee, obviously with the shifts in energy prices we've seen, what I've been saying to the team is now some of those business cases that may have looked marginal a year ago are now much different. So I've asked us to look at our capital programme and opportunities now. It feels right to maybe look to accelerate some of that, particularly where interest rates still are relatively at a low level. We all anticipate them rising again, and then that's ratcheting up the PWLB rate. But actually, if energy prices are going to be locked in at these new higher levels, then it changes an awful lot of business cases, doesn't it? So we're having to look at it through those lenses as well. So hopefully that tries to answer some of your points. I'm happy if there were you think I've missed, either come back to me separately or afterwards. Councillor Grant, you asked about payroll and the general fund, but I think what I would say there as a council, when we talk about payroll, you're right, it's probably our biggest area of directly controllable expenditure if we exclude housing benefit payments, which are broadly about £300 million. So if bear on that. Broadly, our payable is around about £200 million, but of course that includes not just paying staff, but it also includes our national insurance contribution as well as our employer pension contribution as well. So broadly, and you see, I'd say as a percentage, it's 65–70% of our when you think of us as an enterprise, it's providing services that we Well, I think when you think about the fact we have to pay a lot of business rates, often to ourselves, building like this, building like the service centre has a business rate bill of over £1 million. So there's, payroll is a big part of our expenditure, but not exclusively. We have a lot of care packages we provide, and placement costs. The looked after care bill alone is around £25 million. So what I'm happy to do, if it's helpful, Chair, is we've done an awful lot of work as part of our what we termed policy-based budgeting, but effectively a way of helping people understand where we spend our money. So it might be worth, it's okay, me just pulling out some of those slides and sharing it with members of this committee, just to help you sort of see quite visually where the money goes.
That'd be very helpful. Thank you, Ian.
The third question, I hope I tried to cover it with that answer on retrofit capital spend. Is that great? And then on Councillor Garbutt, yours on staff wellbeing. So I mean, it is something that's a real live discussion, not just in Hackney, but across local government in terms of where we are with, pay awards and things like that. But I think for me, what is also important not to lose sight of is that that is just one factor in how we look to recognise the great contributions that our staff make and the vital contribution they make. We also have significant staff wellbeing packages in place in terms of other things beyond pay that we look to place. So what I can do is I can ask the team to share details of that with you in terms of what we do to really make sure we support staff, not just in normal times, what we've been doing to look to try and supplement that in what are increasingly challenging times. And of course, throughout the COVID period, we've really made sure that, particularly where staff have been very isolated or working from home, we've really looked to make sure that they've felt recognised, supported, and helped.
Great, thanks. I'll let you pause and take a drink, Ian. Gilbert.
It is water.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, there was something you mentioned there about kind of changing the terms of some contracts, or whatever, to sort of around efficiency and flexibility and that kind of thing. I mean, obviously, we have made a commitment to end fire and rehire, and we want to try and get that into our sustainable procurement strategy. I just would like to seek an assurance that you weren't necessarily referring to that style of reconfiguration.
I mean,
Ian, are you happy just for take another question from Councillor Gordon? That's I know you're off out the blocks today. Councillor Gordon, Margaret, you've got your hand raised. I think you're on mute, Margaret.
I do apologise.
Okay.
Yes, thanks very much, Chair. I mean, Ian, you alluded to policy-led budget setting. I mean, obviously, this is a new direction for us in Hackney, and I think it's something that we're all very committed to. I think, obviously, with my other hat as Chair of Scrutiny Panel, this is something that I'm hoping to work closely with you and Councillor Lynch on, and obviously across the I think there's keen interest in relation across the scrutiny commissions. I mean, could you just maybe sort of, for the purpose of this meeting, tell us a little bit more about how that approach will work, and what sort of considerations will be taken into account? I don't know whether Councillor Chapman wants to come in on that as well. Thank you.
First question.
You can
first.
start now.
That's okay. Great stuff. So in terms of your question, Councillor Meyer, that wasn't what I was alluding to. I hope that's clear. It was more in relation to where we've got external contracts that might have clauses in them that, for instance, naturally would expect an inflationary uplift. So we're fortunate that a council won't have as many of those as those councils have significantly outsourced services. So I know a number of boroughs have got contracts for things like revenues and benefits, which basically have clauses in them that mean, as you'd expect. There are ones which we will have. We're just working on those to see where there's opportunity to reshape them. It's probably the best description. Councillor Gordon, in answer to your question, you're absolutely right. And I think it's probably important to say that policy-led budgeting basis of that is work which is well underway and has identified an awful lot of information about where the council spends its money, what inputs, what outcomes it has. But I think we also recognise it can't sit alone from the development of the strategic plan, but also has to be embedded in the transformation work that's going on, and making sure that ultimately we can agree a balanced financial plan for the 3 or 4 years. So what we're proposing to do in relation to all of that is take a series of papers through meetings with yourself, with Councillor Lynch, with Cabinet and members, just updating on how that's all going to come together to enable us to balance the budget for 23-24, but also set the framework for how we deliver a balanced medium-term financial forecast through the life of this administration.
Great, thanks. Any more questions on the finance update? Okay, so we can move now. Thank you, Ian. We can now move on to agenda item 7, which is the corporate risk register. And we've got Matt Powell, our risk advisor. And Matt, welcome. You're obviously joining us virtually. Obviously, you don't want to spend any unnecessary time, but it'd be nice if you could just give a little synopsis of what your role is and where you sit with the council, just because for our new committee members.
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, I work under Michael Sheffield, who will be joining later, who's the head of corporate risk, and ultimately report to Ian, obviously the group head of finance and corporate resources. And my role is to help with the facilitating of effective risk management across the council from all levels, whether it's service level, divisional level, directorate level, and then at the highest, most overarching level, the corporate risk level, which is what I've come here today to talk about. So should I give a quick overview of the contents of this agenda item, and then obviously there can be sort of any more questions about the specifics or the overall risk framework that we work within. And of course there will be the opportunity down the line, perhaps not today, but to have, you know, specific detailed training on risk management from the perspective of committee members. Okay, so in terms of this agenda item, this latest version was signed off by CLT, the corporate leadership team, in late May, so just a few weeks ago. And there are some notable changes in this corporate register from when it was last reviewed by Audit Committee, which was in April of this year. There are two new risks that now feature, the first of which relates to the current cost of living crisis and the pressures it will continue to place on the council. Although this is now a distinct risk, most elements have already previously featured amongst other risks. For example, the economic downturn risk. The second new risk on this iteration of the register relates to current recruitment issues all around the council, but most particularly within ICT, reflecting current significant market pressures for digital skills and also some recent high turnover. Additionally, the pension data risk has now been de-escalated back to directorate level. It did feature on the previous version, and this is due to improvements with a new interface. Other major risks remain in place. The pandemic rating has fallen, but clearly further risks remain on the horizon, with new strains quite possible later on within the year. Although the cyber attack was more than 18 months ago, risks do still remain that recovery work may introduce new vulnerabilities or reintroduce vulnerabilities from the time of the attack. Therefore, the controls here protect against this and are clearly meant to provide some level of assurance to members of committee that we are doing everything within our powers to manage against this. There have been additions to this register on the risk on council-owned companies, and Ian alluded before to the PIRs regarding the likes of Croydon and Nottingham councils, where obviously there were serious issues with their council-owned companies. And again, the controls that we provide for this risk should hopefully provide some assurance that we're managing risks in this respect. The climate change risk remains as important as ever and is integral to the council's objectives. Clearly there is a lot of detail within this register, so we'd all welcome any questions.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, I can see Lynn, Holly and Sarah. Matt, would you like the questions to come in a series of 3 or one by one? What's your preference?
Yeah, probably in 3, I guess, and also Michael and Ian perhaps will step in if needs be.
Okay, Lynn, if you want to go first.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to ask questions on the new risks at the moment. Is that the idea? Oh,
No, anything.
no,
Ask
okay.
anything, Lynn.
So, well, I'll you know, on the new risks, I think this building and implementing a single income maximisation service is a really good idea. But what I see there that is, you know, potential fraud risk. So, you know, I'm definitely interested in, you know, what mitigation there would be, you know, to prevent fraud, because it would, I presume it would be bringing together a number of existing services and a range of expertise that may not necessarily cross over and be able to, you know, deal with all aspects of fraud risk. So I do see a fraud risk there. I also wondered, in terms of that service, maybe this is too operational for this committee, but whether there would be a gateway into that service and how that would operate. In terms of COVID, I'm interested to know what the council's position is on staff vaccination. In the summer months, we can forget about this pandemic to a large extent, but I just wonder, in terms of keeping staff well, what the advice is around whether the council has any particular specific advice around vaccination, and any incentives around staff being vaccinated.
Lynn, I'm just mindful that's like 2 questions. Have you got one more? Just quickly, just mindful.
I'll leave it there, Chair, don't
just
worry.
mindful, just because I'm just as other committee members. Matt, do you want to take those? Because that was sort of a number sort of wrapped up in there, and then we'll go on to Polly.
Yeah, I think on the first one, which centering on fraud, Michael, would you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So yes, absolutely. Obviously, there's been a lot of change across Hackney in the last 2 years, driven by the pandemic, the cyber attack, and now the cost of living. And it's been a routine practice now that as these new mechanisms for distributing support to those that need them are introduced, that there is an anti-fraud presence in that we have some involvement in helping to design the services and putting resources in to deal with concerns that are identified once the new schemes are in place. So absolutely, you're right that there is a role for anti-fraud within that, and that will be taken forward.
And I think, Michael, as well, we'll touch a bit more on the next, further down the agenda. We've got a particular item around fraud, haven't we? Okay, what was the last question?
Yes. The second part of the question was to do with staff vaccinations and COVID. I don't want to keep passing the book here, but I think Ian might be better qualified to answer that than me.
Thanks for that, Matthew. I was just going to try and come in first, just to, if it's okay, Councillor, on the question that Councillor Troughton raised as well around income maximisation, particularly to make sure people access all the support that they can get. So I think, as Michael outlined in his response, yes, teams are working very closely together to make sure that we have the necessary arrangements in place to avoid an instance of fraud. But for me, the real outcome of bringing those teams to work more closely together is the real benefits it brings to residents, particularly at this absolutely most challenging time. I've been fortunate because it sort of sits within part of F&R to see some of the work that Jennifer Winter, our head of housing benefits and housing needs, has sort of led on with Ross, who works in that team as well. And it's a really powerful sort of presentation. So if it's helpful, and I'm happy to sort of maybe do an update on that at future meetings.
Thanks, Ian. Polly.
Thanks. I'm going to be cheeky, and I've got 2 questions as well, I'm afraid. One is on the temporary accommodation risk. I'm particularly alive to this as a councillor in Beauvoir, where we host one of the largest temporary accommodation. They shouldn't be called temporary accommodation, by the way. We should rename it emergency accommodation. People live in there for years. There's nothing temporary about it. But I'm interested to, I can see that it's been escalated back in 2017 and remains especially high because of the recent implementation of the Homelessness Reduction Act. What do we see as those long-term risks, since we've already got 3,000 people in emergency accommodation? Are we seeing that? Are we expecting that number to rise? And what mitigations have we got to deal with it? The second one is on climate change. I'd be keen, Chair, if we could explore in the work plan part of the discussion of us having a proper deep dive into the risks around this, particularly on the flooding aspects as well as the mitigation. And I would just make the observation that as Chair of Scrutiny Commission, there have been presentations to Scrutiny Commissions to outline this work, but it is clearly very embryonic within the council on a sort of systematic basis. And I would like, I think, as audit, for us to look more carefully at making sure that the administration addresses this in a more systematic way than it has been done up until now.
Okay, so who is able to answer the question around emergency accommodation? And similarly, more than happy absolutely around the proposal for the climate deep dive when we come to that in terms of the work plan. So Ian, would you be able to be in a better position to sort of, or would
Well,
Matthew?
Matt, is there anything you want to add before I'm going to steal your thunder?
No, I think the the sort of intricacies of it are out of my radar really on the temporary or emergency accommodation side.
So on the temporary accommodation side, yeah, I'm particularly conscious of your ward as well. What I suggest we do maybe hold a more detailed member drop-in session on it, just so that we can cover it in more detail. I can ask the team to come along to that session so we can cover it in more detail. Feels best placed for me.
Just on relation to what Polly's just mentioned around the terminology of emergency accommodation, what would we need to do to sort of rename that essentially, or is it a statute? Is it a statutory term? Temporary accommodation is part of the housing law.
I want to just look at that with my colleagues,
Yeah.
just to see whether
I was just putting it out there,
whether
just
it's a term
acknowledging
we
the.
have to use or not. I think that is
Yeah.
a term
Yeah,
that is consistently used by local authorities.
I accept it may well be a statutory term.
Yes.
I just think it needs to be reiterated as often as possible that there's nothing temporary about it for those families.
Thank you. And I've got Sarah, Caroline, and Zoe at the moment.
So I've got two questions. First one follows on sort of sustainability and climate change. I see we've got the cost of living crisis as risk one at the top there. Just wondering if we considered having fuel poverty as a specific risk because of its close relationship with climate change and sustainability, and also the government and other definitions of fuel poverty, so that the way the risk is assessed would be different if we termed it fuel poverty rather than cost of living crisis. And also the solutions would be different because the solutions are very much about not just about bolstering people's income and dealing with the poverty, they're also about improving the state of the buildings that they're living in. So that's question one. Can I go on to two? Because it's quite a different one. I can't remember what it is. Oh, question two. There's been quite a lot of talk recently about the impact of the ongoing impact of the cyber attack on enforcement, the relationship between cyber attack, kind of unresolved bits of cyber attack impact, and enforcement actions within the council. So, for example, people receiving notices to quit and other enforcement actions because because the cyber attack has meant, for example, that changes of circumstances to their housing benefit haven't been implemented, etc. There are lots and lots of examples of this. I just wondered whether the security of recovery work, or I think it's under that heading, have we dealt with this somewhere within the risks, within the risk register? If we have, I'm not sure I've found it, or it may just be that the headings are a bit at a too high a level.
Yeah, I mean, one point I would say in response to both of those questions is that the corporate register in its nature is quite overarching and very strategic. And with something like the cost of living, if you were to look at, say, a more specific finance and corporate resources register, you would sort of see more clear examples of sub-risks. So in terms of, you mentioned the cost of living risk, I think that's a really good suggestion maybe to think about having a fuel poverty one separated, but obviously that is a sub-risk of the first one. And usually what we try to do in the corporate strategic register is keep things sort of streamlined and simple, although it is a very detailed document by its nature. But I think there's certainly potential to have a more explicit connection on mention of fuel poverty in there, and also in terms of the climate change one being towards the end of the register and cost of living at the start, that the order is arbitrary. They're not ranked in terms of priority by any stretch of the imagination. They're all as important as each other in many ways, although the scores differ. And in terms of the question about the enforcement issues, I mean, my understanding is that has been dealt with by Rob Miller, but that could be sort of further listed as an action point to provide you with evidence of that.
Ian, I think you wanted to come in.
That's okay, Councillor Lynch. Just picking up the point on cyber, and again, it's something that maybe members who are new to the committee aren't aware of. What we have done over the last 18 months is, in advance of Public Audit Committee, we've held private sessions in relation to update on cyber. So Rob and I would be very happy to hold another one of those sessions before the next Audit Committee meeting, just to explain where we are with things, where we are with recovery. And specifically, though, in terms of the points you raised, I'm sure there are some examples that have been raised with you. I'm aware of some that came in today. Once they were drilled into, actually, they weren't maybe what they maybe first were as reported. That's not to say the ones that you raised weren't. But what we do have in place in the council, particularly where it's in relation to those in our own stock, is a very clear system for triaging any issues that arise where, for example, an eviction may be being discussed or on the cards where it appears to be potentially implicated by HB issues. I think when you drill into it, what you'll find is that whilst HB may be a factor, it is not the material factor. So not everyone is fully in receipt of HB. Some people are part, in which case they have to be paying some of their rent. So there's often other factors in play when some of the cases I've probed into. That's not to say the ones you raised aren't not in that space, if that makes sense. But if there are specific cases you've got, and if they haven't been raised with respective teams, happy to look at those.
Thanks. Caroline.
I think that the point about I think that the cap on medicine was a lot. It's not a conviction. Well, I think I sat down and see. I technically almost for achieving something either right at the beginning of the was when the program happened. So something schools in time or achieving that was one example of something from credit, but we've got credit that for children. I mean, so therefore that you're not eligible, it's getting the trigger of it. One is allowed on 20 credit for there's also whether that's whether we do it. And I appreciate my that and then I think better session. But it's like a long one of get down money. What we're doing in terms of then on that's like then what file on. I'm sure you'll prefer the rest of my hold on. I think
So I'm happy to cover an update on.
Just add that that's further compounded by the shift to universal credit, where benefits which would previously have been sort of indicators of entitlement for things is now no longer there, and that's a further complexity which is impacting on our residents.
Thanks. Zoe, do you want to ask a question?
Oh, thank you. So one kind of bundles together cost of living, pandemic and cyber attack, just in terms of making sure that we're reaching those most in need, because I think there was a couple of points, and just picking up on some of the things that other people have already said, but just to, we're all hearing that making sure that like the council tax rebate is getting to those that most need it, not those, I'm hearing from residents, those that don't have direct debit and can't access the internet and etc. are really concerned that they're not going to receive it. And just making sure that we're reaching and telling those that don't have the access to the internet, with the end of Hackney Live and Hackney Today, I'm worried that people aren't going to hear about, some changes to services and ways they can access services. So that's one kind of bundle of how we're reaching people most in need. Completely agree with Polly about the need to deep dive into the climate. I've got loads of questions on the climate risk, and I don't know, I can't cover them all here. One comment is the likelihood rating. I'd say that the likelihood of that is much higher than it's rated in the risk register. And I'd also, maybe here, I'd like to understand a bit more about Hackney Light and Power, about the cost of that, and what its ambition was versus kind of the reality. And then there was just again, probably way more to talk about than we've got time for or space for here. But the whole importance of SEND and the absolute commitment to early help and prevention, but also increasing well-being and making sure we bring the voice of parents and carers into that, and how, because I know the JAP's been set up, which I know about from previous roles, but it'd be really good to understand how parents' voices and children's voices are being included in that, and what we're doing to look at bringing children back to borough, because I know that is a massive cost and out of placement. And I know that that's about increasing and improving our local services, but but maybe that's something I can pick up with the relevant people outside.
I think it's just to come in before you answer, Ian and Matt. I think Zoe, as we go on to agenda item 10, you'll see that we have the work plan, and then you'll have specific some of the things that you've talked about. Absolutely, absolutely appropriate to ask, but there will be more of an opportunity to have a bit more detail. But yeah, gosh, I hope you were scribbling all those down, Ian and Matt.
I think there's some really useful points there. I mean, my immediate thought is we do obviously review the corporate register on a quarterly basis, and this is an ongoing process, and you'll be part of this conversation every few months. And I basically agree with you in reflection in terms of the likelihood there. It should be higher, and I think you'll see that reflected in the next iteration. And obviously this will be an ongoing process, so your input is appreciated.
So in terms of the specifics, if I can maybe try and pick up the particular point you raised about rebate. You're correct in saying, well, the position is at the moment we've paid all the direct debits that we hold have been paid. That's the reality of it. And we're also now in the process of nearly finalising ways for people to apply who don't pay us by direct debit. What we have encouraged people to do, though, is to sign up for direct debit, because that facilitates us to make the payment quicker, and we have seen significant uptake in that. But we are now looking to move through to enable those people who don't pay direct debit to receive the rebate. I would say that when I compare us to, you've seen the stories, and not even going to be able to start paying until September, we're well ahead of that. And it's full credit to Neil Clark and the team in revenues who've done a fantastic job to get us to this point already. In what hasn't been a straightforward exercise. I think using a system that's designed to collect money, to pay out money, isn't something which is straightforward. And just so people are aware, if they aren't, that actually we are reliant upon software providers to provide the relevant updates as well for those systems. It's not just a matter of us switching on a system and it all working as well. So there are complexities in that. But again, it's something that if members would like a fuller update on it, then Councillor Chapman and I are more than happy to provide that.
Okay, and Margaret, patiently waiting. Councillor Gordon. She had it up, and then I noted it. Let me just check if she might have sent me a message. Okay. Last call, Margaret. Councillor Gordon, if you wanted to ask a question around the risks. Here she is.
Yes, I mean, sorry, I've had some connectivity problems. I don't know whether this is being covered, but I just really wanted to obviously flag the cyber attack on the risk register and the comment in relation to unknown risks. Whether we could sort of unpack that a little bit. I mean, obviously, this is a standing item. It's on a sort of flat risk at the moment, but this has been a very, very significant incident, and the impact's still reverberating on our residents in a number of different ways everyone's familiar with. So maybe we could unpack that a little bit more. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Margaret. I think we probably have covered a bit, but just it sounds like Councillor Gordon's had some connectivity problem, but it's obviously we're recording the meeting, aren't we, as well? So I guess any additional I think the question was very similar to Sarah's in regard to that. So I think just mindful of time. Just mindful that Councillor Baffour has just joined us. Welcome, Councillor Baffour. So if we've got no more further questions on agenda item 7, which was the corporate risk register, and thank you, Matt. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And thank you, Ian, as well, for your responses to members. So now, just mindful, we're coming up to 8 o'clock now. We have Michael, our head of audit, Michael Sheffield, is going to present agenda item 8, which is the internal audit annual report.
Thank you, Councillor Lynch, and good evening, everybody. My name's Michael Sheffield. I'm the head of the Council's Audit, Anti-Fraud and Risk Management Services. So I'm ably assisted by Matt, who you've just met, and also Tracy, who is virtually attending the meeting, who is our head of audit and manages the audit team. This evening, I've got 2 annual reports for you. So the first one is to do with the work of the Internal Audit Service. And the information that I'm going to feed back on that, those of you who were previously members of the Audit Committee will recognise the gist of this. It's essentially good news that work carried out by the audit team over the year has enabled us to reach the conclusion that the Council's control framework is adequate and remains robust despite the challenges that Hackney has faced during the year, and they have been considerable. So that internal control, risk and governance environment continues to deliver the level of assurance that has been achieved over recent years. There are some nuances to note that go alongside that top level message. It's important to note that less audit work has been possible to complete over the last 2 years than is ordinarily the case. And there are a number of reasons for that, primarily the pandemic and the cyber attack. The current issue that most affects work under the last year's audit plan is the consequences of the cyber attack. You will note on page 98 of the agenda pack the list of audits that had to be deferred this year because they could not go ahead because of the fallout from that event. So that is primarily the availability of council systems, information, and the extra time resource on various teams to continue to deliver business as usual in very trying circumstances, which means that it's not an ideal time for an audit to take place. The majority of that work has been rescheduled into the current year's audit plan, so it is going to go ahead, but we have had difficulties over the last year. In coming to the conclusion that the assurance about the control environment is at the standard it needs to be and continues to reflect what has previously been the case, we have drawn on assurances from previous year's audit work and other methods of assurance that are available to the council. So, for example, external reviews of different areas will factor into that. So I'm confident in reporting to you the state of the control environment now. The pressing priority for audit this year is to do everything we can to make sure that this year's planned audits do go ahead, because obviously the longer we are in a position of audit work not being able to go ahead at the usual level, the less is the basis of support for having that. There was a low percentage of adverse audit opinions. This was comfortably within the previous year threshold. So positive opinions are reasonable and significant assurance for the overall audit. There are other levels that do not come up to that, but we are getting similar levels of good audit opinions to previous years, albeit on a smaller sample. A higher number of recommendations arose from audit work that was able to take place this reporting year, but of that higher number, fewer were high priority recommendations, which again is a good result. I would draw your attention to the fact that the audit plan that is developed each year contains different pieces of work. So comparing this year's work with the previous year's work is not an exact comparison of like with like. We do have a risk-based audit plan which determines what is looked at, but still you're not comparing exact comparisons year on year. In terms of the key performance indicators for how we measure the achievements of the internal audit work, all of those were met. So that covers time to issue a report from the completion of the audit work, the percentage of the audit plan that's implemented, customer satisfaction, and the recommendations arising from internal audit work that are implemented. So what I've talked to you about so far is for information on performance. There are two appendices to the report, the first of which, Appendix 6, the Internal Audit Charter, which is at page 102 of the pack, is for committee to approve, and the Internal Audit Charter basically sets out what internal audit does, our authority to carry out reviews, our objectives, the reporting expectations, the measures to guarantee that the service remains objective. And it's a statutory requirement that we bring that to you each year for review and approval. I can report that there are no significant changes to the charter compared to the previous year, so there's nothing has changed within that. Appendix 7 is the internal audit strategy. This is a document for information, but again one that we are required to present to you each year. And the reason that doesn't require approval is because it's a 5-year document and we're within that 5 years, so it has been approved previously. So at that point, I'm going to pause and come back and invite any questions.
Thank you, Michael. Do members have any questions? I can see Caroline and Gilbert. Is it Caroline?
Yeah, it was just, sorry. So mine says that there's two audits that are down as cancelled rather than deferred. I think it's more the mortuary and goes over your overview report. And I just wanted to clarify the sort of reason for a decision to cancel rather than defer.
I noticed that.
Certainly. Sorry, I'll take Gilbert's question and then come back on both.
Okay, Gilbert.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Michael, for that. I'm just wondering, in terms of the audit plan going forward, I'm just thinking about kind of learning lessons from, the pandemic, learning lessons from the cyber attack. What did we do well? Could we have done better? What can we build on? Maybe this is something for a work plan, possibly, Chair, I don't know. An action plan going forward, basically, and how we can better the service as a result of learnings that we've had because of these two incredibly difficult events. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take the questions in the order they were raised. The difference between the deferral and the cancellation, the audit plan that is agreed each year is subject to change in year. It's a living document. There will be times that an audit can't go ahead for various reasons, such as the cyber attack, but the work still needs to take place and it will be put off. There are other times where, for example, there might be changes to a service that are so significant that it means that the reason for an audit being in the plan in the first instance are no longer appropriate for it to remain there. And there are other higher priority pieces of work that require audit attention. So you're quite right, there is a difference there, but the audit plan is a living document and it is subject to change in year for those reasons. In terms of the plan going forward, the plan was brought to Audit Committee at the last April meeting, and we talked there about how we determine the plan. So it's a risk-based plan. It considers the risk registers, it considers inputs from senior officers, from events that this committee picks up. And you're quite right that obviously cyber and pandemic are key things that have happened to us of late. following the pandemic, there were a number of audit projects that were brought together under one heading to look at the council's pandemic response, and that reported on, and that gave some positive feedback as to how the council had responded to key parts of that. So, for example, we looked at I believe how the business grants had been managed, how the council had worked to distribute food, and there were other parts to that audit review, and it was positive assurance that came back. With the cyber element, we have not been able to undertake a review of that, of the IT section this year, to be honest, because that team has been so busy responding to the emergency. But the current year audit plan does have a number of audits within the IT area. We've agreed those with the director of IT. You might not be aware that it's a specialist field IT audit. We do have a contractor that provides that service to us, and we have agreed the work with them. So work will take place during this year to look at IT issues in general, including things that are directly of concern following the cyber attack.
Okay, are you both happy with those responses? Yeah. Okay, so can we just then just approve the annual internal audit annual report? Yeah. Okay. And Michael, stay primed, because we're coming to you now in agenda item 9, which is the fraud and irregularity annual reports. And again, I'm sure you'll be very concise with your summary.
Sure. This is a report to note. It gives a summary of the investigations work that has taken place during the last year. You will see that the volume of referrals of fraud matters has increased this year, which is not surprising because they were suppressed during the previous pandemic year. Blue badge and tenancy fraud referrals in particular have grown. If I just give you a brief synopsis of the key areas that the investigators deal with, we have no recourse to public funds, which deals with providing enhanced checking of applications for financial support from people that do not have recourse to central government funds. The number of applications that the council received from people seeking help under that banner was less than it was previously the case this year, which has resulted in a smaller number of adverse decisions refusing a support package. And it's worth noting that there's quite a significant financial cost that results to Hackney for each case that is taken on. That's not just the direct support given to families in terms of accommodation and support packages, it's also the cost of the social work caseload that results from that. What I've always been very keen to make clear about this work is we talk about other investigations in terms of fraudulent applications and people defrauding the council. I've always had a different view of the no recourse to public funds work that we undertake. It is not an affluent client group. It is people that are in difficult circumstances, and the difficult decision is working out whether Hackney should be the one to provide that support through taxpayer funds, or whether there are other means of support available to those applicants, which under the legislation would mean that they have other means of supporting themselves or seeking support. So I think it's important to make that distinction. Moving on, what this committee has historically been most interested in is the outcome of our tenancy fraud work. So during the last financial year, 34 housing units were recovered following investigation. So that is people that are subletting primarily, or sometimes abandoning their property, or false claims for succession. And there was a question earlier tonight about what the council does about temporary accommodation and the large numbers of people that do not have access to permanent accommodation. Since I've been involved with this work at Hackney, we have recovered in excess of 900 properties that have then been available to provide to people for housing that are on the temporary accommodation list. It's probably worth noting as well that we undertake these inquiries not just for Hackney, but for a number of the registered housing providers that operate in the borough, where Hackney achieves information that results in a tenancy coming back for a registered provider. We would receive additional nomination rights. So even there, it's somebody being helped from our waiting list from the work that's carried out. The other large area that we get involved with is blue badge investigations. Compared to some of the other areas, it's not high value in terms of money, but certainly in terms of the disruption that's caused to disabled people and their ability to park near to services and facilities that they need, and to support them as they go about their lives. I am aware of the implication it has for those people. So we respond to reports of fraud, and there's also regular proactive events that are carried out to target hotspots of misuse. Most recently, there was an event on the 26th of May, and that resulted in 4 vehicles being removed, 11 penalties being issued to people misusing a permit. We confiscated badges and warnings were issued. And where appropriate, we will follow up with stronger action. So, for example, some of those vehicles that were removed were displaying stolen permits. So we would take that at the higher level of offending there. The cumulative financial benefit of the fraud investigations this year is put at 3.1 million. By definition, there has to be some estimation there, but we do use widely accepted measures wherever we make those calculations. That 3.1 million compares to a 2.3 million figure the year before. So that was the depths of the pandemic, but we do still have some way to recover to pre-pandemic levels. So in 1920, the value of the work was 5.7 million. So we're recovering, but we've got a way to go is the message there. And at that point, I will pause and take any questions that anyone has.
Thank you, Michael. I've got Zoe, Caroline, and Sarah, and Lynn.
Thank you, and thanks, Michael, for this really comprehensive report and for the information you've provided outside of committee. It's been really, really helpful, and I appreciate the comments you've made about people with no recourse to public funds, which I share a lot of what you said and what's also mentioned in the report about people acting out of need and not greed, and the conversations that we've had about, this is very focused on, a very small group of people that are often, acting out of need and not greed. And I am interested in following up outside around, the wider work to look at stopping fraudulent, our residents experiencing fraud and what we're doing wider as a council to stop kind of larger business fraud. But I just had 2 really kind of quick short questions. One on the team, the no recourse to public fund team, and just confirming that's a permanent team, because I think the work that they're doing sounds brilliant, even though obviously they're navigating a horrendous kind of home office system. But that team sounds like they're doing some really great stuff. And just if there's anything that's been done to prevent blue badge fraud. I know you've touched a bit on what you're doing to kind of follow up, but I just wondered if there's anything done on the prevention. Thank you.
My question follows on from that, so shall I go next?
Yeah. You happy, Michael? Because it's probably are similar. Yes. Go on, Sarah.
Just to add on no recourse to public funds, and I may have just missed it in the report. I just wanted to know whether part of that team's work is to then identify alternative sources of support. So, for example, where there is no recourse to any public funds, so neither under the Children Act nor anywhere else, does the team also support people in accessing charitable support?
you want to take those together, Michael, and then we'll go over and we'll ask Caroline and Lynn for their questions because it might be easier.
Certainly. So the no recourse to public funds, I should have made clear this is not solely an internal audit initiative. We work completely in partnership with Children's Services, and internal audit provide an investigator to assist with inquiries to gain information that otherwise would not be available, to make sure that Hackney makes the right decision on those cases. It is a permanent team. The funding for the investigator is reviewed each year. So it's not permanent in the same way as other parts of the service are, but I've had very strong support for the investigation's involvement, and certainly the team this year was supportive that we continue, and we have those arrangements in place for the year. In terms of identifying alternative support, yes, it's looking at it from Hackney's perspective. It's in our interest if there are other means for people to support themselves with. So part of the job is finding out if that support is already there. Sometimes it is, people are getting support, and the harsh reality is if they're being helped somewhere else, then Hackney does not have the responsibility to provide additional support. If that's not the case, if we find that someone is without any means of support, then they would be getting a support package from the council. So if we found that there was no other means of support, then it would be Hackney that would help them. And I'm sure that there would also be signposting to charities for, not just financial means, but for other mechanisms of support and support groups that would help people. In terms of the blue badge and the prevention work, the preventative side of it is more about, from my perspective, it's more about the proactive working, not just waiting for referrals to be put through to the team, but there are certain places where we know that it's advantageous to have use of a blue badge, and we will comes from that. We never have those operations and don't manage to achieve something. Perspective is it's another one of those areas where we work with services, so that the on-street work is with the parking enforcement officers, and we have facilitated them having access to some of the blue badge information on handheld terminals, so that they can effectively be the eyes and ears of the fraud team, and pick up concerns as they're out and about doing their duties, which in some ways it sounds like an obvious thing to do, but previously the fraud was identified by the fraud team. Now, instead of it being 2 people that are doing that work, we have an army of parking enforcement officers that are out there, and they will refer things through to the team, and we will assist them with making sure that misuse is targeted and dealt with. So yeah.
Great, thank you, Michael. And Caroline and Lynn.
Yeah, but the first thing is, on this point, right, about the fact that the patient not necessarily thought. I guess I have a general question is as to as a fraud consideration. So I'm sure that across a lot of different service areas we run registers fraud. And I'm not clear why an RPN is specific to identify as an area of focus priority area, but it's specifically about fraud rather than verification, trying to make sure we're identifying the right things, for which you definitely verification of the fraud. And I guess the reason why I'm particularly concerned about that is that evidence that the NRPS high court, which are vulnerable in the cohort talk about the other categories of risk are very nervous about what body, what the free. And as soon as we introduce terms like fraud and refer to that as fraudulent additional barrier and risk concern that not access us, while that might be most of us figuring out unauthorized funding correctly, another risk that which is generally need or not access to support. And the other risk that we have is about so I guess I just had three questions. One was about understanding why.
Caroline, can I just ask you to put your mic on? Just mindful that people.
So the first thing was about understanding better the decision to characterise this as being something sort of a fraud work stream, as it were. The second is what are we doing to ensure that if we are doing that, we mitigate against that risk of it becoming a deterrent. In terms of measuring that, I would be really interested to know that figure that we have in terms of claims cancelled, whether that's claims we cancelled after a positive finding that something was incorrect and we shouldn't have been issued it, or if it was due to, for example, people withdrawing from the process because they were nervous about verification. And again, I appreciate you might not have this data on you just now, but within that bit in terms of claims being cancelled, to the extent that we know which ones of those were claims that were cancelled because of good faith errors of trying to navigate a complicated system, as opposed to things that met what we'd characterise as the fraud threshold.
Great, thank you. And Michael, can we just take Lynn's question? So whether or not it's related to no recourse to public funds.
Thank you, Chair. I just wondered whether you made any use of unlawful profit orders or proceeds of crime acts, and whether you employed financial intelligence officers within the team to support investigations.
Okay, thank you for the questions. I'm going to be honest, I didn't hear very much of the first one, and I'm sorry, I was sitting there quietly and it ended up being a very long question and I didn't make that clear. I picked up that it was about no recourse to public funds, and I certainly got the bit about the difference between claims that are cancelled because we find that someone's not entitled and those that withdraw. I do actually know the answer to that one, I'm pleased to say, because we had a Freedom of Information request about it quite recently, and of the cases that have been dealt with in the last year, one of those was someone withdrawing from the process. The rest were all following findings, and it was also a case from memory that withdrawal from the process, it wasn't right at the start of the process. It was when some difficult questions were being asked, and it was when the applicant found out the level of checking that the council was doing that they withdrew from the process. So I hope that gives a bit of assurance that it's not just an unwelcoming front door that is driving that. It is, in the overwhelming majority of cases, actually going out and finding that there's an issue with the claim and that there are alternative means available to people. I hope that answers the question sufficiently. I'm aware that the question was longer than the answer.
So sorry, I think that's really helpful. I think
Sorry, Dawn. Of course, Dawn, of course, yeah.
The other bit was just that it was understanding why this is sort of being treated or looked at as a sort of fraud issue, as opposed to something which is about potentially misrepresentation and verification.
Do you want to come in on that? Michael's, yeah. Sorry, Michael, come on. No, sorry.
Yeah, it's about making use of a skill set within internal audit and anti-fraud to find out information, to have access to different council information systems and external information systems that can give us a fuller picture of a person's circumstances, where there are grounds to suspect that they may not be telling us everything that we ask them to tell us that we need to know to assess their claim. So, as I say, the title fraud sits across the team that I manage, but we're at pains to be clear that there's a difference between fraud and people looking for extra money, albeit they might not be entitled to it as it stands, but they are in a difficult position. So it's recognising that.
Can I just interject before I bring Dawn in as our head of legal? I'm just mindful, one of the things that we'll probably come to as we talk for the work plan for the year is about bringing to life some of what we talk about in the audit committee. And I'm just wondering whether or not it would be useful for members. There obviously seems to be an appetite for this sort of thing around people that have got no recourse to public funding, whether or not you could actually obviously respecting confidentiality and such like, whether or not you could present to the committee members some scenarios to sort of bring that to life, because clearly there is obviously a need to sort of look at both sort of sides to this. Obviously awareness that these people are in complete distress, but mindful obviously as well of the sort of legal position. So that might be quite timely for Dawn to come in. Is that what you were going to sort of maybe touch on?
Oh, thank you, Chair. So I just wanted to add some context to the question, Councillor Selman. So with regards to the assessments that are completed by Children's Social Care, so there's a very small team, but a really excellent team that will complete an assessment, will ask all of the pertinent questions. It's only at the point where the answers that are being received and documentation that's been received by the social work team that a referral will then be made to colleagues in Michael's team to ask for that further exploration to be undertaken. So it's usually in circumstances where the local authority has received information which totally contradicts the information that we are being given by those persons who are presenting as being, having no recourse to public funds and need the support and the assistance of the local authority. And I think I can assure colleagues, and I'm sure that assure members, and I'm sure that colleagues from Children's Social Care will also be able to do so as well, that the assessments that are completed by Children's Social Care are completed with the mind to assist and to help. So there's the signposting that's needed as well, but also it's in those very rare instances where it's almost very obvious. So we've had a number of cases that we've also been challenged on by way of judicial review. We've gone to court, to the High Court. There have been orders that have been made, which we then challenge. So it's just to kind of give that comfort, in a sense, to know that where those cases do go over to colleagues in Michael's team, the fraud element is because the information that we've received and is being presented, unfortunately, doesn't back up the information that's being given by the individuals. But that support is still provided, so people are not turned away. The support is provided whilst we complete the assessments as an authority, and then a decision will be made to conclude the matter in one way or another.
Great, thank you, Dawn. Is that okay, Caroline? Lynn, Michael, did you get notes for Lynn's question?
Yes. So the team does employ a financial investigator, and we make use of the POCA powers where that's suitable. So POCA is the Proceeds of Crime Act. What it basically allows us to do is that they're quite intrusive powers at their full extent. So it allows us to get extra information to support inquiries where there's where we meet the thresholds to, for example, get information from banks about people's financial circumstances. In extreme circumstances, we are able to restrain monies that people hold and to confiscate money through POCA. That is not something that happens often and has not happened for some time. The use of the more powerful powers. We do make use of unlawful profit orders on the tenancy side, and in truth, there's probably scope for us to do a bit more of that, and that is an intention for the team.
Great, thanks, Michael. Okay, we're all done with that, I think, now. And some great questions, and thank you, Dawn, for your contributions to that as well. So we're nearly on the home straight. We're just coming to agenda item 10, which is the Audit Committee work plan, which is for noting. So this is section agenda item 10, and this goes back to the comment I made, so just for new members to the committee, is that we obviously have like a core sort of work programme, as you can see. So we have that sort of continuity of updates, which I guess is so important from what we've heard tonight. But one thing that would be useful, and just mindful of the time, and we can continue this outside of the meeting, is just try to think about as a committee those particular areas that we can do some deep dives. So we've referenced that previously the Audit Committee has undertaken deep dives into the housing revenue accounts and other sort of areas where we've wanted to sort of maybe get under the bonnet a little bit more as much as we can within the governance of this committee. So I've noticed that I think there's already been a suggestion around sort of continuing some of the work we did around the climate deep dive, which would, I guess, support some of the other scrutiny commissions. And also one thing that I would sort of put out there as chair, which I think would encompass what Sarah suggested, was around fuel poverty, and particularly around the cost of living, but in terms of the position of our council, which I think would then sort of tie in potentially with some of our biggest risks that we've got at the moment. So we've already heard, haven't we, around the costs to some of our services that we provide, and sort of, you know, understanding where that is and what the end point that might be in worst case scenarios. And I don't know, I'm open to have a quick sort of discussion here if anyone wanted to contribute anything to that, or we can pick it up outside of the meeting in terms of the work plan. I mean, I'm just trying to get some guidance. Sorry, I'm just looking at you, Ian, in terms of, because obviously the sort of burden, the majority of some of this work will be undertaken by your teams, and sort of what the ambition would be in terms of, do we do one and then sort of subsequently sort of come back to the next committee, or can we do two pieces at the same time, or what would take your advice as sort of officers in terms of
I think
not wanting to repeat
certainly.
any work, but I imagine there may be some work that's already been undertaken around this.
So I think in terms of cost of living, that's something that in reality is going to be with us for, you know, it's not just a piece of work that will conclude. I envisage us doing updates throughout the course of this municipal year on that, and working with you to do some deep dives. So very happy to do that, because it is going to form very much part of the shaping, I suppose, for want of a better word, of the financial frameworks we're going to be operating within. And, you know, there'll be the impacts on the council, but as Councillor Burton alluded to as well, it's the decisions we take and our resident, and the impact on residents, i.e., you know, putting up income by such an amount that no one can pay it, so you end up collecting less income, is a perverse decision. But there'll be other things we need to do in that space. I think on the housing revenue account, it probably feels to me that that we got into quite a decent groove on that in terms of updates from Steve and the team, working with Deirdre and Simon. So I'm very happy for us to bring back, if it's okay with members, so as opposed to a deep dive, to bring back like the slideshows updated we brought last time, so you get the sort of detail in that context. And I think the other one I had there was climate. I imagine that's also been picked up quite extensively by some of the scrutiny panels in different places, but certainly happy to bring back an update to this meeting on the climate action plan and the financial aspects of that. That obviously is something we're working on at the moment, and there's, you know, so if we maybe structure it to have cost of living running throughout, and then sort of more set piece on climate action plan financing and regular updates on the HRA, that probably feels to me reasonable. We did also touch on, if it's okay, Councillor, just so it probably feels an update of sorts on SCND would be helpful, because there is quite a lot moving in that space. So as opposed to lots and lots of sessions on it, I think what we'll be in a position to do probably for the next meeting is an update of how the wider landscape in that space is evolving in terms of the interventions that the DFE is bringing to bear, and the limitations to that as well, and the sort of variations, whether you're a safety valve or whether you're a value, better value authority in terms of how they're classifying you and the type of support offered. But we'll know more about that again in over the coming months. So it probably feels to me that those give us some quite chunky topics to reflect on alongside the usual finance updates.
Sorry, Sarah, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I know I'm banging on about this a bit, but just I'd quite like the fuel poverty piece to be specifically dealt with, perhaps as part of the climate change work, not just as a kind of ongoing, this is part of the cost of living crisis, because I do think it has very specific relationship and complex relationship with our retrofitting plans and, you know, our climate change and sustainability work. So it's not just a bit of our poverty, it's also how does this feed into the order in which we do the retrofitting, how we fund the retrofitting, etc., etc.
That's fine, and certainly I'm fortunate chairing the the council's officer group, Sustainwell, and the member group on the sustainability board, and fuel poverty is something that regularly is raised as an issue there. So that would be part of updates on sustainability. No problem.
Sorry, Polly, Gilbert's just before and then Polly, yeah.
Just to add to Sarah's point, in terms of our deep dive into the climate stuff, it would be nice to look at some obstacles to attaining net zero. So, you know, council finance, infrastructure provision. I'd just like this to be noted, and innovation, skills gap, residents engagement, and obviously tackling fuel poverty and stress. So I think it's really important to be thinking about obstacles and how we may consider overcoming those obstacles. Thank you.
Thanks, Gilbert and Polly.
Yeah, I was just going to make the observation that in here, well, on the 18th of January, we're due to have a Directorate Risk Register review from Neighbourhoods and Housing, and I think that should probably be reconfigured to the Climate, Economy and Housing Directorate, which will of course cover all of these things, right? So the new Directorate has all of these responsibilities in there, and what we want to see, particularly from that Directorate, is these things properly integrated, proper metrics for economic generation, economic development, an understanding of the impact of climate change on the cost of living and vice versa. And obviously housing is not only the new build, but also the retrofit. So I think that will be an opportunity for us to be able to get into it, at least at the start.
Which meeting was that?
18th of January.
It's the
in
January
the work
one.
plan.
Are we happy
item
to
3.
keep it to January, or can we jig it around, or would members?
Bearing in mind we're supposed to be seeing a published climate action plan this year, we'll have one to review by January, won't we?
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so on that note, we're now just moving to any other business and anything that the chair considers to be urgent, which you'll be glad to know there is nothing urgent, but I'm just going to make reference to any other business and just repeat for those members that may not may have missed this, is that we as an audit committee are going to be providing some additional training opportunities to new members. So either myself or Peter or Michael will email that out to members as well. There's some specific training by SIPFA, and also I think we've picked up some also additional things that we want to do. Yes, Gilbert. It wouldn't be any other business without you, Gilbert.
Thank you, Chair. I thought the Treasury Management training was really great, so thank you for that. And I think more of that is really beneficial because it's such a large kind of complex area and it's really helpful. But I've also in the past mentioned I would like to kind of get another training session on the methodology behind how we do our risk scores. So if that could be noted and maybe action at some point in the future, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, and just off on that note, Ian, just some feedback, and I think I've been sort of when we've met sort of obviously pre-meeting and such like, is one of the things that I'm incredibly want to do as chair, and I think also sort of to help the committee generally, is I think we need to really try to put sort of the residents behind these numbers that we see, and I think if there is any possibility that when we are doing the training that we are able to use more sort of tangible sort of case studies or examples. So when we are talking about sort of, you know, the cash in and the cash out, you know, I think you yourself were able to articulate an example of one of our housing supply programs, but I'm just thinking about how everyone knows that I do like a visual and pictures and things, but it just makes it a little bit more, and I think as well, you know, we're live streaming and it makes it a bit more palatable to our residents as well if we can get a story behind the numbers, because there's definitely, that's what we're here for, is for our residents. But anyway, thank you all very much for attending this evening. Thank you for those that have been watching online, and I guess we now formally close the meeting, don't we, Peter? Thank you.